Good morning, everybody. The time of the chime is 10:30. It's time to get this show on the road and us get commercial. This is the meeting of the House Commerce Full Committee. Madam Clerk or Mr. Clerk, would you please call the roll? Who's calling today? Mr. Clerk.
Here. Present. Here. 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 Powers. Here. Parks. Here. Thompson. Here. Towns. Vital. Here. Zachary. Here. Vice Chairman Bricken. Here. Chairman Vaughn.
Here.
Chairman, you have a quorum.
Thank you, sir. Given the fact that we're coming off of our winter break, however short it may have been, I'll entertain any personal orders from anyone. Representative Haston.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just help me welcome our 911 directors that are here today visiting us.
Not going to lie, it makes me a little bit nervous. Who's minding the store at home while you're here? All right. Anybody else? Have I seen another hand? All righty. Well, we are going to get on with our business. For those of you who have been following what we're doing here, one of the aspects that this committee oversees is utility legislation with regards to utility regulation. And one of the things when you're around this body that you'll notice is that we are a dynamic group. There's members coming and going, leaving for whatever reason, new members being elected. And so sometimes that can affect a body's institutional memory and understanding of issues that come before us. And so we're taking a little bit of a move down to understand and almost a remedial class in utilities and utility regulations that we oversee here in the state. Last week, we dealt with water systems. Today, I believe we're going to be discussing electric co-ops and municipal electric systems. We've got guests coming to talk to us about each of those. And committee members, I had someone point out to me, someone who tends to be a little bit critical of myself, but however, I'm self-reflective enough that I understand that I sometimes can misstep. We're going to let our presenters complete their presentation before we interrupt them with questions, and I'm going to be diligent with writing my own questions down so that I can ask them after their presentation. Last week, we threw both them and myself off kilter a little bit because I was blurting things out as they came across my brainwaves. So we're going to do this a little bit more orderly today. And first up, we have some testimony from the Tennessee Electric Co-op Association. And if we could, Mike, if you could introduce yourself and tell us who you're from, and then pour forth on us knowledge that we need, and we will sit here quietly and respectfully and then pepper you with questions once you've concluded.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I tend to work great in more of a stream of consciousness, so you interrupt me whenever you feel led. My name is Mike Knott. Oh, yes, Mr. Chairman.
Stand by, Mike. We're out of session. Hit it now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Mike Knotts, and I represent the Tennessee Electric Cooperative Association, which is the trade association representing 25 member electric systems across Tennessee and actually into some of our neighboring states as well. And so today we have a goal just to share a little bit with you about our history, why electric cooperatives are the way we are today, and how that history has shaped the current day. And most importantly, want to share with you the structure of why we came to be and how we operate. And I always believe strongly in starting with the end in mind. And so that the thing you need to remember today that I'll go through in more detail in my presentation is that we are locally governed, we are organized by the state, and we are regulated by the federal government. We may be the most impacted by government regulation of any of the utilities in the state, but my colleagues across the industry may agree or disagree with that. But we feel that the structure works well. So electric co-ops We are consumer-owned entities. So we like to talk a lot about electric cooperatives as being member-owned. And so sometimes when I say the word member-owned, I kind of get a blank stare back, and people might pull out their membership card to the Kenny Chesney fan club and say, I'm a member of that as well. And that member term in terms of utility is a legal term, and that denotes ownership. Just like you might be a member of an LLC or the member of a partnership, member in this case denotes ownership. We are owned by those for whom we serve. So I'm a member of my electric cooperative, Middle Tennessee Electric, and if that cooperative were to be disbanded or sold, the proceeds of that sale, I get my proportional share of the proceeds of that sale. The ownership flows directly back to the consumer who's consuming the services. But we also operate not for profit. So that's where we also get some confusion sometimes when you and I or you and our members back across the state have conversations, is that we are not-for-profit entities. So we're private sector, but not for profit. And so across Tennessee, as you all very well know and are learning through these presentations, the overwhelming majority of utilities in Tennessee are government owned. We are privately owned. We are owned by our customers. So we're private sector, but also not for profit. And we think that combination works incredibly well in how we serve the people of Tennessee. And we are also very much community focused. Because of that ownership connection, the co-ops work diligently to be important members and great corporate citizens all across the state. I venture to say, if you live in a place where you're served by an electric co-op, you know that the electric co-op is deeply involved in your community. We're anchor institutions across the state, particularly in rural parts of the state. So here's just the quick history lesson, and I will try not to spend an incredible amount of time on this. I want to focus on the present day. But electric co-ops came to be for a very interesting reason. By the early 1930s, most of America's towns and large cities had already been electrified. But small towns in the countryside simply did not have access to central station electric service. And it seems almost anathema to us today when we just take for granted the fact that any room we walk in, we can flip a switch and instantly lights come on and the room is cool in the summer or warm in the winter. But that was not true for a huge portion of America's farm communities at that point in time. The large investor-owned companies had set up shop all across America and were serving where they found it to be profitable to do so. So in large cities, there was often a power company serving those citizens. In a number of cities, governments set up their own power companies as well. So those were municipally owned electric systems. But the small towns and the countryside of America was not electrified. And there was an unbelievable disparity in the quality of life between those that lived in the cities and those that lived in the country. And I would really encourage you, for those of you who are history buffs, and I'm looking across the room, and I know a lot of you are, there's a great book called The Path to Power. And it's a book about LBJ, about Lyndon Baines Johnson, and his ascent through local politics to eventually becoming president of the United States. And one of his early small p political activities was helping organize his electric cooperative, because the hill country of East Texas was not electrified in the 1930s. And there's a tremendous couple of chapters in that book. It's noted in the footnote of the slide about what life was like for those individuals who lacked electricity. And it will really give you some perspective that's amazing. So if you're a history buff, please go read that book. And it'll help you give some appreciation to what the co-op means to that community and communities all across America. So what was causing rural electrification to not happen was simply population density. The business models of an investor-owned company did not see enough return on investment to enter into those rural areas. There just simply weren't enough people in a given area to provide enough return on that investment. And since those rural areas didn't lay inside the boundaries of a city, mayor out into the countryside as well. So what happened to solve this problem? It was widely seen as a societal problem all across America. Happened through the United States government, and Congress decided that this was a problem that needed to be solved. But what was wonderful, and they did this through a couple pieces of legislation, But what happened was not a large government agency. It was the most successful public-private partnership in the history of this country. Wisely, in my opinion, and that of the electric cooperative community, instead of creating a large government department to physically go and electrify the countryside, the federal government realized the best path to solving this problem was to empower those individuals who were in need of electric service. And so what the Congress did was enable low interest loans that allowed people to form cooperatives that would then were owned by themselves and were created for the purpose of helping themselves. So farmers and small town merchants all across America joined together, and they did the work to build their electric cooperative. And they owned that cooperative, and still these entities exist through today. And that approach of government, of properly placing a government incentive, but not requiring consistent government involvement in the running of those operations, has paid off in spades for rural America and small town America. And again, I just simply state, I think it is without a doubt the most successful public-private partnership in the history of this country. So today, these co-ops now still exist across the state. We'll get into some of the specifics about co-ops in Tennessee next. But electric co-ops roughly serve 2/3 of the landmass of our state and about 1/3 of the people. So unlike a lot of the utilities in cities, we have to spread large capital investments over large geographic areas over relatively small numbers of people. Those of you that are in business know that math gets difficult pretty quick. But the advantage that cooperatives often have is our long time frame. We understand that these capital investments that we make to run the electric system are generally for assets that have useful lives of 40, 50, 60, sometimes even greater number of years. And so we're able to spread those investments out over time. But where history impacts us today, electric co-op owners across the state today, we pay lower rates. Your constituents who are members of electric co-ops pay lower electric rates than all the averages across the country. We enjoy 99.96% reliability across the state now, and that 0.04% is most often issues that are outside of our human control. Last time I checked, we don't control lightning, and worse than that, we don't control squirrels. You'd be amazed how often power outages are caused by squirrels. And so obviously that's what the apparatus at the local cooperative is about, is to help it maintain this infrastructure, to build new infrastructure where it's needed. And importantly, electric co-ops in Tennessee have much lower debt than our cooperative brethren across the country. And that low debt pays off by having less need to service debt and therefore lower rates for all of us to enjoy. So I think the co-op story, as the history is very, very interesting, but as we move into today, it's a great success story even through today. Just quickly, I mentioned the fact that our infrastructure is spread differently. In general, you see some of the comparisons here. I'm going to talk about municipal utilities and electric cooperatives for just a second. We generally have much lower density, back to the history of why co-ops came into existence. So typically we see about 7.4 of our owners per mile of line that we build. So you think about poles on the side of the road and the wires that are on top, about 7.4 customers per mile. Whereas our colleagues in the municipal arena typically have around 48. And you can see the difference there in terms of revenue. Whereas we're typically living on about $16,000 of revenue per mile of line. And then you see the breakdown I just gave you in terms of population. Cooperatives have to be lean and mean and frugal because that's what it takes to make the dollars and cents work. As we mentioned before, almost 3 million Tennesseans today are served by an electric cooperative, about 1 in 3 of our homes, and we're present in 85 out of 95 of Tennessee's counties. I would also note that the overwhelming majority of Tennessee's persistent poverty counties are served by an electric cooperative. We are very aware of and understanding of the burden that people of low income have in paying their energy bills. We know that it's an important part of their life. We also stand with them and walk with them through the struggle sometimes to afford those bills, because we serve the places in this state where poverty is a persistent problem, a number of those places. And so a lot of people don't tend to think about rural and persistent poverty in the same sentences. And that is definitely true here in Tennessee. It's also true nationwide. The map you see on the screen in front of you is the electric cooperative footprint across America. And you can see the tremendous amount of land mass of this country that are served by electric cooperatives. 832 individual cooperatives, 42 million people, 1 in 8 residents, and 92% of America's persistent poverty counties are served by an electric cooperative. And just to be clear, that definition is where 20% of the population has met the standards for living in poverty over 30 years. So these are long-term issues of poverty. So we understand what it's like, and we work very diligently to be local partners where people can trust us and rely upon us. Now, I will kind of dive very quickly into differences you need to be aware of. So when you talk about the electric utility business as a whole, we talked earlier that there's 3 types of ownership, and I'll mention those again in just a moment. But there's 3 types of electric utilities in general. When you think of a large power plant, you think of a big nuclear station or a hydroelectric dam or a coal-fired power plant. That's generation. That's the production of energy. So think of that like a factory that produces shoes, for instance. The generation part of electricity is the manufacturing. Then you have transmission, which these are the large kind of erector set style towers that you see oftentimes out in the country, sometimes nearby, interstate paths. And the purpose of those large structures and the wires that are contained are to move high voltage, high quantity power from the manufacturing location, from the generating stations, to the places of consumption. So think of the electric transmission system kind of like a trucking fleet for that shoe factory that moves the shoes from factory to the local store. So the distribution component of the electric sector, this is where electric cooperatives live. In Tennessee, electric cooperatives are in the distribution business. We are not in the generation or transmission business. In Tennessee, both generation and transmission is exclusively the venue of the Tennessee Valley Authority. So all the electric cooperatives in the state currently purchase all of their wholesale energy from TVA, who generates it at their facilities, transmits it over a transmission grid to our local distribution utilities. And then the electric cooperative takes possession of that energy and moves it to your home or your business across the network of typically wooden poles that you're used to seeing along the side of the road. So those 3 distinctions will come into play as we have these conversations about how things are regulated and who owns what. But there's also 3 different types of ownership. And so we've already talked about this, so I'll be very brief with this. As you know, cooperatives, we're owned jointly by our customers. And so membership is required in order to receive that electric service. You must provide membership, and that traditionally means providing capital. Now, a lot of you have had this same experience when you go to shop at REI for some backpacking gear. If you don't know, REI is a cooperative. And the first time you go to shop at REI, they're going to ask you for a $5 membership in order to shop at the store. And that is your contribution of capital to the cooperative. And so our members contribute capital to the cooperative, and that's one of the things that makes them an owner. As I mentioned, we're not for profit. And as I mentioned at the beginning, our primary governance comes from the owners of the cooperative. Each cooperative is governed by a board of directors who are elected in open elections by the owners, by the members of the co-op. And so I like to tell a lot of you, because we're all involved in politics and we understand a little bit of shorthand, that running for a co-op board is kind of like running for the county commission. There's a lot of similarity in terms of the scope of the election, the numbers of people you need to go out and touch, the numbers of people you need to talk to, but oftentimes the number of people you are responsible for after you are elected to the board vastly exceeds that of a county commission district. Public power is broadly more the government-owned utilities in Tennessee. Those are primarily municipally owned. I'm sure my colleague Jeremy Elrod will discuss that in more detail in the next presentation. And then there are also all across America investor-owned electric utilities. These are companies like, you know, the large companies we're used to that are owned by shareholders. That stock can either be privately or publicly held. Profits are returned to those shareholders through dividends. And the governance is directed by the shareholders, not necessarily by the customers. In Tennessee, there's only one investor-owned electric utility, and it's present in Kingsport. It is part of the American Electric Power Corporation, which is based out of Ohio, but it's only in Kingsport. So now into some of the nitty-gritty. I talked about local governance. Our local boards of directors govern the day-to-day operations of our cooperatives. But I do want to talk first about the state role in how we are organized. State code specifies how an electric cooperative is organized. So our primary code of jurisdiction is the Rural Electric and Community Services Cooperatives Act, that is in Title 65, Chapter 25. And that dictates things like that we will operate at not-for-profit and that we will provide universal service. It also designates that an electric cooperative in Tennessee has a primary purpose, and our primary purpose is delivering energy to consumers. But it also authorizes us for secondary purposes to enter into other utility services to support economic development. And I will say quickly that your local electric cooperative is a key partner to economic development efforts across this state. We help fund a number of the local economic development agencies. And anytime there are corporations or companies looking to expand or bring their businesses to Tennessee, one of the first questions they ask is, can I get power? And the second question is usually, can I get broadband? And oftentimes the electric cooperative is the key to answering those questions to potentially bring that business to our state. It also, our code also gives us specific powers under state law. It allows us to generally to conduct business. And the code is very specific about the fact that we are allowed to do business activities, to take on a corporate seal, to buy and purchase property, to mortgage that property, all the things that you would typically find contained in the general corporation statutes that are in Title 48 of the law. It also gives us because we are in the electric business, it does grant us the power of eminent domain. I'm proud to say that it is very, very rarely, if ever, exercised. Co-ops generally have great relationships with our members, and when we do need to acquire property, we've found over the years to be very successful to deal directly with property owners, offer fair compensation, and so that authority is very sparingly used. The code also dictates some of the basics of our governance structure. It says that we will have a board of directors, and it dictates the structure of those boards and the election and the fact that those must be elected. It creates requirements for us to hold meetings for our members. Again, member meaning owner. So we are required under state code as to how we provide information about basic financial statements and basic operations to our members on a regular basis, and allow our members to interact with us through an annual meeting and other mechanisms throughout the course of the year, and to engage in that governance process. The law dictates how a cooperative might merge with another, how we might be sold, or how our assets might be disposed of should a cooperative, heaven forbid, ever find itself, in a bad shape. The law does touch all that. Taxes. Most of you are aware of this because as I look around the room, you've got great relationships with your community cooperative, but some of you may not know that electric cooperatives are almost always the largest taxpayer in the areas in which they serve. Our tax structure is that of ad valorem taxation. So our property is assessed every year. The Comptroller's Division of Locally Assessed Properties assesses the value of an electric cooperative every year, and we pay taxes based on the value of that property, and it is then paid directly to our local communities. Again, almost in many cases, we are the largest taxpayer in your local community. And the state code specifies that because of our member ownership and our local governance, we are exempt from PUC regulation, State Public Utility Commission regulation. Now, in addition to 6525, as nonprofit corporations, we are also subject to the law contained in Title 48, Chapters 51 through 68, which is our general nonprofit corporation statutes. And so there are a number of requirements. This is the code that would govern a homeowners association, for instance, and any number of other nonprofit entities that set up and conduct themselves across the state, either in the case of commerce or for the benefit of individuals. It's a very large, wide section of law. We're subject to that as well. There are a number of places where those two laws conflict, and when they conflict, the Electric Cooperative Code supersedes that of Title 48. And there's actually a Title 6525-125 specifies in great detail which specific sections of Title 48 we are excluded from because those things conflict. So I mentioned we are locally governed. We are organized at the state level. We are then regulated at the federal level. We are subject to the regulatory oversight of the Tennessee Valley Authority. And so what that means to your constituents is that the rates that we charge are regulated by TVA. So they have the ultimate authority to approve or disapprove of the rate structures that we implement, which then, based upon consumption, ultimately determines the eventual bill that you or your constituents pay. They also have regulatory authority over a grouping of activities we call service practice standards, and that impacts also policies that the cooperative board might want to set. Things like the fact that we cannot discriminate among customers inside of the same rate class. So we cannot have a separate rate for a residential customer in one location than we do for another. If they are inside the same rate class, meaning they are all a residential customer or a specific type of commercial customer or an industrial customer, there are various different rate classes. But inside of those rate classes, we cannot discriminate among those with differing rates. As you see on the screen, TVA is an independent federal agency, and the United States Congress has given TVA the same authority over electric cooperatives and the municipal utilities that are served by TVA of a state public utility commission. So that's contained in the Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act of 1978. If you really want to nerd out with me, that is called PURPA. And I love to talk about PURPA. And then most of you, when I do that, either give me a grin or fall asleep. So that there's two pieces of law there, PURPA, but it was the original authority for TVA to regulate us came through the TVA Act of 1933, which established the Tennessee Valley Authority. It was simply affirmed in 1978. Now, a number of you, and even as early as this morning, I've talked with a member of this committee about the electric business in Tennessee and how it came to be that it is a monopoly structure where there's one electric service provider providing service to any given customer, or in our case, owner in the state. And so the state statute, as it is in every state other than Texas in this country, state statute specifies in detail that a monopoly service is in the best interest of Tennessee's ratepayers. And this is based on the incredible capital cost that's contained to build duplicative facilities to serve an electric customer. And so we've operated under this structure since at least the late 1960s. Forgive me for not remembering the exact date that was enacted. But there was a point in time in which the service territories were simply kind of frozen in time, and those service territories only change upon the mutual agreement of two utilities. Perhaps they might agree to swap territory, or perhaps one might agree to absorb some area of the other. Maybe it pertains to a new development or a new industrial facility that one's better suited to serve than the other. Or for many years, annexation was another route to changing those service territories. A city could annex property outside, annex property into the city, and if that property was served by an electric cooperative, the city could choose to incorporate, if that city had a municipal electric system. Sorry, I should have added that condition. If the city had a municipal electric system when that annexation took place, they could choose to annex those customers into the municipal electric system as well. That caused great consternation for a number of years, but that has essentially subsided since this legislature did away with annexation by ordinance several years ago. And most of you in this committee were here for that legislative debate. So the legislature has determined that is in the best interests of Tennessee's consumers. And again, from a financial standpoint, it does make sense. So that local flavor is what we're really so proud of with electric cooperatives. We exist to serve our owners, and we're governed by our owners through that board of directors. And so that board of directors develops the specific policies inside of the state guidelines that are implemented through statute and inside of the federal regulations that are placed upon us by TVA. The board then creates those local policies that govern how the co-op does business on a day-to-day basis. Primary is the selection of management. Our boards select the CEO or the general manager of the cooperative, and that is the key to their implementation of how policy is implemented. They set policies, they hire the management, and then they monitor to ensure that those policies are followed. Taxes is a specific question that comes up. I mentioned that earlier. Cooperatives do operate on a not-for-profit basis. From a federal standpoint, the IRS classifies electric cooperatives as 501c12 organizations. Again, if you want to geek out on it a little bit, you can go look up 501c12 and see the differences between a C3 or a C6 or a C12. But we are 501c12 organizations, so we are not subject to federal income tax because we do not earn a profit. Any revenue we collect beyond the needs for expenses in a year, those are margins, and those are reinvested into the cooperative, which is another reason why we're able to keep rates low and lower than a lot of the national averages that you saw on the screen earlier. As I mentioned earlier, sorry, this is a little bit of a repeat. Our property is assessed by the comptroller's office, and we pay ad valorem taxation on that. Right now, the number is about $65 million a year in taxes that are paid by electric cooperatives. And I would say to you, as a whole, the electric sector in Tennessee may be the single largest taxpayer in this state. The Department of Revenue, I've asked for many years for them to confirm that for me, but they do not provide specific information and do not rank in this way. But, cooperatives, electric co-ops are paying about $65 million in taxes directly to our communities. TVA, through its in lieu of tax payment structure, last year paid over $340 million in taxes to our local communities. And your municipal utilities have their own setup as well, which I will leave to Mr. Elrod to discuss. But on the whole, there is a tremendous amount of support going to our local and state governments through the taxation on electric service, on electric utilities, not on the service. In trying to wrap this up here, electric co-ops now are about $3.2 billion of annual sales in this state. But important for you to know, that number gets a lot smaller for co-ops very, very quickly. Our cost to buy wholesale electricity that is produced and generated to us by TVA accounts for greater than 70% of all co-op expenses. At some cooperatives, it can be as high as 82 to 83% of all of the cooperative's revenue is paid in wholesale payments to the Tennessee Valley Authority. We own and operate about $5 billion of assets in the state. And I mentioned earlier, we operate lean. We have average margins of about 5% across this state. So it is impossible to, bring it home to the penny. We are not-for-profit companies, but that doesn't mean you can set up your structure in such a way that you earn 1 penny more than you spend every year. Margins are a necessary part of the business. But what's great about the cooperative structure is that those margins are then reinvested into the company. And that's why our debt is so much lower than the averages across the state. Employ about 2,600 people, over $100 million of payroll. A lot of you know working at the co-op's a good job. And I'm particularly proud of our workforce. Electric linemen do one of the most dangerous jobs in America. This very committee took action last year, and I want to thank you again for the action you took to help protect them as they do this dangerous job. You passed some legislation. Chairman Vaughn, I was particularly thankful for your comments as we worked on that legislation, both privately and to the committee. Electric line workers do a very, very difficult job. It's also a blue collar job that pays very well. And so it's a great career path for a lot of our fellow citizens. These are guys that are making a lot of them are, with a little bit of overtime, you're making 6 figures. And we take very, very seriously our duty as companies to train them and to keep them safe. And our safety programs are a very key part of what we do on a day-to-day basis. But I can never, ever speak to any of you, particularly into a microphone, without thanking our electric line workers across this state. They do tremendous, tremendous work. We rely on them every single day. And to whoever's listening, to all of you and to whoever's listening, I would say the next time you walk into a room and you flip the switch and you're annoyed that the light doesn't immediately come on, first of all, I understand it. I feel exactly the same way. But remember that when that does happen, it takes a human being to get out and to drive in a truck and to climb a pole and to risk their life to restore that service to you. So I can never do this talk without thanking our line workers. Lastly, I will talk just briefly about broadband. So based on some of the history we talked about a minute ago, some of you might have recognized some of those societal issues from the 1930s as it related to power, as it might relate to some of your communities today when it comes to broadband. The state only granted electric cooperatives the authority to enter into the broadband space in 2017. Many of you were here for that and will recall that as the Broadband Accessibility Act. I'm proud to say that electric cooperatives have jumped in headfirst. We see this as a real issue of our day, and a number of co-ops have made significant commitments and significant financial investment to closing the digital divide, because frankly, the people we serve are the people that are having these problems. That yes, there are pockets in our urban communities where broadband service is poor or non-existent. But the issue of rural broadband is really maybe one of the only bipartisan political issues that we have today. I think Republicans and Democrats can agree that access to reliable broadband is essential for participation in today's society. It is no longer a luxury. I would say 10 years ago, even some of our cooperatives looked at, access to the internet is nice. But today we understand it is a necessity to operate in the modern economy and to operate just to simply be your family. And I think the pandemic has taught us that. The important thing to remember is that broadband, unlike our electric business that I just spent so much time discussing with you, is essentially an unregulated and competitive business. It is non-territorial. So broadband providers in this state most of them seek return on investment, and we applaud that. And there are tremendous services being provided by the investor-owned broadband companies in this state. There are also broadband providers who are not for profit, like we are. For instance, the telephone cooperatives, and they've done great work to connect great parts of a tremendous portion of our state. And so Governor Haslam and this legislature decided in 2017, sort of the missing piece of this was the electric cooperatives. And so I would note that if a cooperative chooses to enter into the retail broadband business, they must form a independent subsidiary, must form a separate subsidiary. And that subsidiary under current law is prevented from being subsidized by the electric utility. That subsidiary that enters into the business must stand on its own and must operate under the same rules as other broadband providers. The electric utility can't, for instance, say, "Hey, you guys had a bad year. Here's a few $1,000,000. Don't worry about it." Absolutely not. That is subsidization, and current state law prohibits that. And actually, most of our cooperatives have entered into this space hoping for the opposite of the example I just gave. That as broadband systems mature and provide revenue, that perhaps money will flow up from the subsidiary into the parent and help our electric businesses keep rates low. And we're on a path to do that in a lot of places. And I would note again, we're subject to the same regulatory and franchise obligations as all other broadband providers. And lastly, I'll note that of the private companies in the state providing broadband, electric cooperatives are the only entities that have some sort of restriction on where we can offer those services. And so that's a topic for another day, but I just want to note that does exist. So that concludes my presentation. Chairman Vaughn, good job. Thank you for letting me work through. I would have been happy to accept your questions along the way, but I'm happy to accept any questions or discussion that the committee would like to entertain.
All right, before I log in, I see Chairman Boyd. I've got my capable assistant, Ben, is going to make sure it gets seen. Chairman Boyd, why don't you?
Thank you, Chairman Vaughn, and Mike, appreciate you coming today. And I just want to reiterate too the appreciation we have for those linemen that are out there. With the tornadoes hit back in 2020, the Middle Tennessee Electric linemen and the linemen that came from other communities to backfill them did an incredible job, and we can't thank them enough. I have two questions. One is on the broadband. When they create a subsidiary entity to provide broadband, is that I think you may have said this, I just want to clarify, is it also a cooperatively owned not-for-profit, or as a separate entity, is it a for-profit?
As a subsidiary, its ownership is the parent cooperative. So the electric cooperative would own the subsidiary. So it is a cooperative of a cooperative, if you want to put it that way. It does not have independent ownership. The owners of the electric cooperative also own that subsidiary, and they can be structured as for-profit or nonprofit. In either case, as in almost any business structure, if there is excess revenue, the excess revenue flows back to the parent.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, one follow-up. Oh, another question. Recently, cyber attacks have been in the news, and it is becoming a real concern, not just for the electrical grid here in America, but for all utilities. I'm sure that's a concern at TVA. At the state level, with all the co-ops that serve Tennessee, is that something that they are being proactive? Can you speak to that?
Absolutely. It's a very large concern. A lot of the intrusion attacks, the ones you see in the paper are generally, somebody tried to cyber attack, or hack, a nuclear plant or some sensitive piece of infrastructure. The overwhelming majority, I can't prove this in actual statistics today, but anecdotally, the intrusions that I hear about the most are at the local level. Cyber attacks, they want to find the weakest point in the system. So electric cooperatives, we work collaboratively with all segments of the industry. It's one of the reasons a question like this is one of the reasons I went through the time of explaining the difference between generation, transmission, and distribution. We work together with our generation and transmission partners, with our fellow cooperatives across the country, with a lot of three-letter agencies that are headquartered in Washington, D.C., through our national association and through the national associations of the investor-owned utilities, as well as the municipal utilities. We are all on the same team when it comes to cybersecurity. And so there's a tremendous amount of effort surrounding that. And, that is, you're right to ask that question. It's something we're concerned about, and we work to thwart on a daily basis.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Vice Chairman Brickens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and a great presentation, very informative. My question certainly stays on the broadband and the issue dealing with the non-territorial statement. It certainly in my district, there are territorial lines between the electric co-op and the municipal districts. And I'm not sure if it's formal or informal, based on what I understand is a long-term standard that I don't get in your territory and you don't get in my territory. Yet right outside of municipality, there are citizens not getting broadband that our municipal district would love the service. So of the 7 co-ops that are not providing broadband, when they're not providing it, why shouldn't a municipality be able to offer broadband for those extended customers that are willing and desiring the broadband service?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'll leave the shouldn't part to you and your colleagues to determine, but I will just be clear. So I did talk about the territorial arrangement of our electric systems being set in statute. Then when it comes to broadband services, electric cooperatives are prevented from providing broadband service outside of its electric system footprint by statute. Similarly, municipal electric utilities who have entered the broadband space are prevented from providing broadband outside of their electric system footprint by statute, but it's in separate locations in the statute. So therefore, there are no electric cooperatives and municipal utilities competing against each other for broadband because under state law, we simply couldn't do that even if we wanted to today. So that's why that does not occur. As to your question about why shouldn't that occur, that's a policy decision of this legislature. And that is one that I imagine you will have the opportunity to consider this year.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Chairman Powers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and great presentation. I agree. For our 911 people, I just wanted to mention, had a client one time, was talking to him, and she said her husband was holding his chest, he's a recliner, maybe having a heart attack, and she said, what's that number for 911? And we did get him some help, and he turned out okay, but I just thought that was it's something I've never forgotten. But going back to our question on this, and it kind of touches on what Vice Chairman Bricken was talking about. Do you not have contract with, if you have a municipality, I have 2 rural co-ops in my district, but when you have a municipality that does not offer it, then you could actually contract with them correctly to offer broadband in the area. If they choose not to offer it, is that contract, are they working out okay? Don't you have those available?
I'll address that in just a second. I'm glad you made the connection to our 911 community. I should have mentioned during the course of my presentation, electric linemen are often first responders. We operate in that space. A great example of this, if you recall the tragic accident that happened in Smyrna a few years ago when the Blue Angels jet number 6, when Captain Huss crashed and lost his life. I believe it's Captain Huss. I'll feel really bad if I got his name wrong. When that crash occurred, the first responder to the scene were linemen from Middle Tennessee Electric, because that jet clipped a power line as it came down. And the fire and EMS services were unwilling to access the crash site until it was made certain that there was no live electric current present. And so in so many cases, 2 years ago, we honored some linemen from Mountain Electric Cooperative on the floor of the House who rescued a person who was in a vehicle that was in rushing floodwater. And the bucket truck from the electric co-op was the only way they could access the vehicle safely. So oftentimes, our guys are first responders, and we treat them that way, and we give them that sort of respect. Now to your question, sir.
And we had the same thing happen in my area where a helicopter hit some power lines about 5 years ago, and they went out. They were the first responders too.
Yeah. So now, as to your question, I want to make sure I understand the question as you stated it to me. Under current law, the electric cooperative is not allowed to provide broadband service to a customer of a municipal electric system. So you talked about contracts and partnerships. I'm not 100% certain what you're referring to, but in the broadband space, that ability does not exist today.
My understanding was that it did, that if you had a municipality that chose not to offer broadband, that they could actually contract and I guess do like an attachment fee or whatever and contract with the co-op to offer broadband in their footprint in some maybe rural areas that did they not go out there? And because I think that's already taking place in some places,
Well, I'm
correct?
not at a retail level that cannot take place because it's illegal.
Okay.
Electric cooperatives and municipal utilities work together on electric issues all the time. There are situations where towns have chosen not to, in their history, chose not to form a municipal utility and granted a franchise agreement to the cooperative to provide electric service.
Mhm.
So sometimes those types of agreements might get confused together. But no, under current law, an electric cooperative could not provide broadband service to a customer of a municipal electric system. But again, I say you might have the opportunity to examine that issue during this legislative session.
Okay. We need to talk after
Sounds
this is
good.
over. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Chairman.
Representative Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much. I'm as someone who's been under a municipal electric system for all my life. This is new information and very impressive information too. I just had a couple of questions to verify what you've said. One, did you actually say that customers under a cooperative pay less for electric power than those under a municipal system?
I would believe the statistic I put up was that electric cooperative customers and members in Tennessee pay 17% lower rates than the national average for a retail electric customer.
Okay.
So no, you can compare rates of individual systems, and it stands to reason that a municipal provider could or should have lower rates because of their economy of scale.
Right.
And it is often the case that the cooperative rates are higher because of that lack of economy of scale. So if I did say it in that way, forgive me if I spoke improperly. But no, the statistic I put on the screen was about compared to the national average.
Okay. Thank you. And
Yeah.
also, you're so uh, uh, cooperatives are required to get all of their electric power from TVA.
Okay, that is not a legal requirement. It is a contractual requirement.
Okay.
Every cooperative in the state is currently in a contract with TVA. The minimum term of that contract is 5 years. The maximum term of that contract is 20 years. And those that are on the 20-year contract, actually in both cases, those contracts automatically renew every year. So if a cooperative were to decide to seek another power supplier, they could give what's called give notice to TVA that they intend to terminate the contract, and then there would be that term before such a termination could actually take place. And so the term is different based on the contract, but it's either 5 or 20 years.
Okay. Thank you.
Chairman Zachary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mike, just
Thank
a
you.
quick clarification question regarding the ad valorem tax. Is that go to the locals or does that go to the state?
Local.
Local. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks.
Sure.
Representative Towns.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excuse me. As well, thanks for the presentation. Obviously, a lot of great knowledge, Mike. We appreciate it. EMPs, are we protected basically against EMPs across the co-op spectrum?
So the easy answer to that question is no. Electromagnetic pulse devices, that's a threat that to the electric grid that's universal, not just in Tennessee, but in America and the world. There is a lot of conversation. I mentioned some of those 3-letter agencies earlier that our industry works closely with at the national level. And that is absolutely an issue that we pay attention to and work on and are concerned about. But if I would love to give you the assurance that should such a device be detonated in Tennessee, that we'd be okay, but I can't give you that assurance.
Well, what do we do to make sure that we are in Tennessee? However, it's a national concern, because, and there are devices that already exist and we know some other countries have them. I'm sure we may have in my portfolio. You never know who's going to do what. Okay.
That is-
However, the deal of it is that at the end of the day, it's worse than a hacker because it kills everything we're doing. We go into the dark ages if we don't have the protection. So what's out there that people are talking about that we may need to look at from our standpoint as well as yours to protect us from that kind of stuff? I know it's a heavy question.
Yeah, it is a very heavy
Okay.
question, and I'll be quick to say that is way above my pay grade.
Right.
I would love to tell you that there was an easy answer to your question. There's not.
That's not.
I think the majority of that answer lies in counterterrorism, and if I said any more than that, I would be writing checks that I can't cash.
Right,
So
I got it.
I'll probably
Okay.
stop there.
Okay. That's a great answer because it's true. All right. Now let's talk about also energy in the mix. Does solar fit into y'all's equation in any kind of way?
Absolutely. So,
Tell me a little bit, please.
all right. So again, back to that discussion of, the factory, the trucking company, and the store. We're the store. So we sell the energy that the trucks bring to us. And so we're a store that sells all brands. We've got Nike, we've got Reebok, we've got them all. And so what I'm very proud of the work that TVA does is that the mix of energy, the way they generate electricity and transmit it to us is very diverse.
Okay.
They have a very diverse generating fleet. Is the terminology we use. And so you're never at one time ever consuming just nuclear power or just solar power or just natural gas produced power. You're always consuming a mixture of all of those electrons that are generated in different ways.
Okay.
And so based upon hour by hour, minute by minute conditions, that mix changes over time. And so solar is continuing to grow and become a more and more important part of that mix, particularly at the utility scale. Because of economy of scale and the movement in the market, I mean, some of the biggest solar companies around these days are headquartered right here in Nashville, Tennessee. At least one of them is. And so we're very excited about the movement towards more renewable energy. Particularly now that the economics of it are at parity with a lot of the traditional sources of power. But again, we don't, as the shoe store, to continue my metaphor, we don't directly generate a lot of solar power, but we encourage it, and a number of our owners are installing it themselves in their homes, and there's a process for that. And so we're happy about where things are going with solar.
Thank you for that, Mr. Chairman. As it relates to economy of scales and looking at just Shelby County, one of my colleagues and my neighbor down there was asking about municipalities. I'd like offline for you to tell us how your co-ops that have an average of 17% lower, how does it compare specifically to our area down there? You don't have to do it now. I'd like to know that specifically. And finally, what do you think about our infrastructure? Are we in good shape as it relates to cooperative infrastructure across the state?
Thank you. Yes. I mean, as far as the electric grid is concerned, I'm very proud of the job that cooperatives have done in reinvesting and continuing to improve our electric grid.
Okay.
I'll only speak for cooperatives. We feel great about the state of infrastructure. Again, we build things that are meant to last 50 to 75 years oftentimes. And so is there old infrastructure that we own and operate? Absolutely. Are we working in cycles to replace and refresh those things as needed? Absolutely. And I think our cooperatives are doing a great job of that. You're welcome.
Thank you, Representative Towns. Representative Holtzclaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And one of my questions was addressed where we got into pricing with municipalities and co-ops, because I'm a TBA municipality versus the co-op. The other thing that was mentioned in here, I think Representative Powell's mentioned it, and I think definitely we're going to have legislation that allows you to jump over on your broadband footprint. So I worked on that last year. So I think that's a good thing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Thank you. If we got anybody else, because kind of a little bit of housekeeping, we've got the room until noon, and we're going to turn it over. I believe the municipal folks have agreed that if we can extend this, but we'll probably do that on Monday. I'll give an announcement for that. It'll be an extra credit day, but frankly, I have more I have more questions for the munis than I have anything else, since I do live in an area that is heavily affected by the municipal provision of power. But I've got some questions for our guest, and it has to do with this ownership, because you talk about owners and you talk about members, and a member's not necessarily an owner. A member gets to have access to something, but they don't have equity. And so are co-ops owned by members or owners? How's equity determined in this equation?
That's a great question. And in the cooperative example, the word is the same. The equity is in the member owner. Oftentimes we'll hyphenate it. We'll say member owner. So for instance, I'm a member of Middle Tennessee Electric. It's a electric cooperative. If that cooperative were to be sold, I get a proportional share of the proceeds of that sale. The equity lies with me. So if your cooperative has 25,000 members, you own 1/25,000th of the cooperative. So your membership is proportional, and it's based on your membership certificate.
So I guess when you sign up, you get a membership certificate.
Correct.
And and it's all based upon a per capita determination.
Yeah. So I mean, if a sale were to take place, after the debts of the cooperative are resolved, the remaining proceeds would then simply be divided by the number of members.
All right. With regards to the retained earnings, I know you're governed by a board of directors, and so there's some connection back to the members because the board is actually elected by the members. This information is given in annual reports, I suspect, and that's called out in the statutes.
Yes.
All right.
So the way that works, to be clear, so we provide that type of financial information typically through our annual meeting process. It's available to any member who wishes to receive it simply by calling the cooperative, visiting the cooperative. So that level of information is available. When those margins do exist, they're allocated to individual members. So you, as a member of the cooperative, a portion of that margin is allocated to you. Those margins are then reinvested into the utility. Now, this puts us in a little bit of a different position than cooperatives in other parts of the country, who will often retire a portion of those retained earnings, meaning that they then provide a refund to you as an owner. In our case, we are prohibited from doing so by our federal regulatory body, the Tennessee Valley Authority. And so they insist, because of the dictates of the TVA Act of 1933 that requires them to seek to provide electric power at the lowest feasible cost, that we do not provide those refunds. We reinvest them. And so what the net effect of that is, rather than providing a X number of dollars of refunds, and then the next year needing to borrow that same amount of money in order to build a new substation, for instance, we use the cash margin to invest into long-term assets, and therefore our debt is lower. That's the kind of the secret sauce as to why electric cooperatives debt in Tennessee is so much lower than the rest of the country. By keeping debt low, we have less debt service, less need for higher rates to pay for that debt, to create revenue to pay for that debt service.
Thanks for preemptively answering my next question, because when you're a member of a farmer's co-op, you get a check
Correct.
every
Correct.
now and then, and
Correct.
it may only be a couple of $100s, but at least you get something back.
Yep.
In the mail.
Yep.
You bring up an interesting perspective, though, and you keep referencing the Tennessee Valley Act of 1933, and in their rate control, their provision of rate. Do they set your rates, or does your local board set your rates? Because I may be mishearing.
Thank you. That's a great question. The local board will set the rate. TVA approves it. So the TVA has the ability to say, no, that rate's not consistent with your financial condition. That's not consistent with the criteria they set forth. So there is a process by which TVA reviews all of those decisions. The local board does get to make the decision essentially inside of a window, inside of a set of guidelines.
All right, so we're dealing with, and we're getting down into an area that I find to be fascinating and one that's fraught with risk and turmoil as well, and that is that TVA serves as your power supplier, yet they're also your regulator.
That is correct.
That's goofy. That is one of the strangest things, and I understand in 1933 when you're electrifying the valley, that we're glad they did, but that seems that it's fraught with peril, is particularly in an environment whenever we're talking about long-term power contracts that you are purchasing from your regulator. That's something that is, to me, and I know that that's a federal act that we don't have purview over, but it seems very strange to me that this industry is governed by its wholesaler. I think it's something that is troublesome, and it's something that I think that, because right now we're talking about, and I don't mean to get into Mr. Elrod's presentation, but we're talking about, do you really have the authority? You talked about your power supply contract. Do you really have, is it really in your interest to not buy your power from the TVA? Because if it's not, we haven't seen what it looks like when we have utilities that are regulated by TVA that are not wholesaled by TVA. That's a question that's on the table right now, but it's a very, my question is how much ownership do those members get to exercise when it comes to long-term power contracts?
That's a very good question. The way I would answer it is this. The overall net effect of the partnership, for lack of a better term, between electric cooperatives and TVA over the course of history is overwhelmingly positive. But there are cooperatives today who are examining the very questions that you're asking. And so there are a number of cooperatives who have entered into the new longer term agreement because they're very comfortable with their relationship with TVA. There are also cooperatives who are examining what it would look like to do something different. And obviously these are, 9-figure type decisions that require a tremendous amount of due diligence and would be groundbreaking, at least particularly in terms of the state's, the structure under which electric utilities have operated in the state. But those examinations are taking place. And so I can't get into much more detail about those individual electric utilities who are examining that, but you are on the right path that some are thinking in those terms right now and examining what the pros and the cons would be.
Well, I can assure the co-ops and the munis and anybody else in that is that one thing about an electrical system is that it is a grid and it is a network. And nothing happens in a vacuum.
Correct.
Across this network. And one thing that's going to be looked at that will come at some point into our laps here in the state legislature is going to be, what are the impacts to the balance of the state on decisions made by individual members and individual utilities across the state? Because again, nothing on electrical grid happens. So I think that we've got some challenges before us as we see what happens in the marketplace unfold. But I would say that we're going to have to take a long view and a long, hard view at some of the things that are going on in the marketplace with regards to power. And I think we're going to have to ask some questions. Is this system that has evolved over the last 100 years, does it need updating? Does it need upgrading? Does it need to be thoroughly looked at? Because that's really the crux of what is our responsibilities here. Let me get to Chairman Hazelwood. You got a question for us?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, a follow-up on a question that you asked earlier on the member owner. If I'm an owner, if I have equity in a company, then normally that equity stays with me regardless of if I move or, die, and then it becomes part of my estate or whatever. But a member owner of a co-op, is that ownership only during the period that you're being served by the co-op?
Yes.
So it really is a different definition of ownership than a normal, equity. I just wanted to make that clear. Thank you.
All right, Representative Powell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you being here. Appreciate, I know your headquarters located in my district, so I appreciate that. One question I think that I wanted to ask, and I'm going to ask this of others too, is we have a unprecedented, obviously from the Infrastructure Investment Act that has been passed, money coming down from the federal government. A lot of that's going to be left up to the states on how to allocate that. And I want to make sure that that is done equitable and spread out so that, you know, both cities and rural areas, all communities have access, not just to energy, clean energy, but also, you know, expanding broadband. So can you speak to, you know, and I know this is kind of a somewhat philosophical question, but how we go about, you think the best way to spread that about equally and make sure it's equitable when we distribute those funds to the state?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And again, I'll gladly say that maybe a little bit out of my pay grade. I will say we're paying very close attention to the flow of these funds. Thus far, you know, the American Rescue Plan Act has focused on water, sewer, and broadband. And so we're paying a lot of attention and working very collaboratively with the Department of Economic and Community Development, specifically about the broadband portion of those funds. The larger piece, the infrastructure bill that you referred to that came from Washington, there is still quite a bit of detail to be written. A lot of that bill was in Washington was telling different departments, federal departments, here's money, and now you go write the rules on how that money is going to be used. So primarily that work is done on behalf of electric cooperatives by our national trade association, the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, and we're engaged deeply in those. I don't have a ton of detail to share with you about that, but we are sensitive to the topic you brought up. We historically have had to have those conversations to say, hey, sometimes, you know, if the Congress sees a tax credit as against federal income tax as the way to incent an activity, hey, that leaves us out because we're not-for-profit entities. And so we're used to engaging in that way. I wish I had a more specific answer for you. I don't today, but I would love to continue that conversation down the road somewhere.
Chairman Sparks. And then we're going to finish up with you, Representative Towns, coming back to you. One last one.
Thank you, Mike, for good job y'all do, and David Callis in the audience, and Chris Jones. You know, y'all recently, speaking of economy of scales, y'all acquired Murfreesboro Electric, which I thought was a wise decision. The partnership with United Communication is just awesome. I mean, I was speaking to our county commission, and broadband's been a big concern for a lot of the rural county commissioners. And I just looked up the reviews of United Communication. It was like 714, ratings like 95%. When I first got elected up here, I was a little distrustful of co-ops, and, you know, I always kind of see myself as a private sector kind of guy. But I see how, I mean, to me, with all the problems in the world, it's refreshing to know you can turn that electric on. You know, you got electric heat pump working, your blower and your, you know, natural gas units working. I mean, it's refreshing with all the problems. But we had a transformer go out a few months ago. Man, I looked out, y'all had a truck there within 5 minutes. You know, my father-in-law was a lineman, and when I was dating my wife, I watched him get up 2 in-the-morning, 3 in-the-morning, snow and ice, go to work, fell off a telephone pole once, watched one of his fellow linemen get killed with NES. And so I appreciate you and the other reps recognizing them. But your Tennessee Magazine, read it every month. I enjoy Bill Carey's column. And just want to say thank you to Jeff Davison and Joe Marciani with United for always communicating with us. But it's refreshing. I mean, I think y'all probably got one of the best co-ops in the nation, would you say?
I love all the members of our association equally.
You know what I mean? I mean, you really do. And when the Blue Angel went down, that's my district right there. We named a bridge after him. Very, and I don't know if anybody's go by there and see Captain Jeff Coos's memorial. That Smyrna's done a great job. Mayor Reed done a great job with that. So I just want to say hats off to what y'all do. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Representative Sparks. And I'm glad to hear, as a supporter of the private sector, you also love your co-ops, because the co-op is the private sector. So,
all righty. Last question of the day goes to my friend from Shelby County.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you very much, as well as all other comments have been made. But I want to just simply end with this. As we look at the mix and determining whether or not we're going to, in essence, with the chairman's comments, look at competition, I think we should. But I think also what we need to make sure that's front and center that what these guys do, TVA, generation, absolute of our power, the transmission of our power, and the distribution of our power. And anyone else that we look at must be able to do those kinds of things in order that our power stay. We still have really low costs in Tennessee compared to the rest of the country, from what I've seen, what I've read.
That's correct.
We got really good rates. And a joke can sell you picking a whistle, don't mean that whistle gonna blow. We got to make sure that we thoroughly look at what it is, because once it's like Humpty Dumpty set his butt on the wall and Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. Once you crack that egg, you can't put it back together again.
Well,
Okay.
I would, sir, I would encourage you to applaud the local utilities in this state. That low retail rate that that customers enjoy is largely due to that low margin that I talked about earlier that the local utility enjoys. We can have a much longer discussion about the current state of TVA's rates for wholesale power, but it is the hard work and diligence of your local utility that is keeping that local rate, that retail rate, where it is below those national averages.
And businesses and senior citizens and regular citizens, thank God for those lower rates, and we want to keep them that way. Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thank you as well.
Thank you, and I can't think of any better segue than Humpty Dumpty with regards to this. One of the I appreciate the committee members staying with us through these conversations, because when we start looking at reliability versus rates, that's a question that we're always gonna have to reconcile ourselves with. And just so y'all know why I like to geek out on electric supply, not only am I a licensed electrical engineer, but my first job after farm labor was I was on the working end of a tamping power poles at Bolivar Electric Department. Shout out to Earl Dillinger, my line crewman, my line foreman. But anyway, thank you for being here.
You're welcome.
The statutory references you gave were extraordinarily helpful to us. I think I can speak for those of us who haven't heard presentations like this, that it was useful to us, and we look forward to continuing our discussion. And I'm going to confirm this, but I believe it's going to be Monday afternoon. We'll have another extra credit session, and then we will move on. And just reason enough to be back here next week is in this very room at this very hour. I will announce the closing date of this committee. With that, we are going back in session, and we will adjourn. Excuse me, announcing the last calendar, not the closing date, but we'll announce the last calendar. Thank you. Mm-hmm.